For all its beauty and splendor, the ocean can be a cruel teacher. A storm at sea showcases how powerless a man truly is. When the winds rise and the waves grow tall, the ocean becomes a beast that no ship can tame. And when the storm passes, it doesn't leave peace in its wake, just a vast emptiness. You're left alone, surrounded by a silent, indifferent ocean. The horizon stretches in every direction, a mocking circle of nothingness. Out there, in the middle of its endless expanse, you realize the truth. Survival isn't about strength or willpower. It's about the whim of the sea. It decides who it lets live and who it takes. Let's venture back to the unforgiving ocean where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. For José Salvador Alvarenga, his fishing expedition would be horrendous. The shore of Costa Azul came alive in the morning light. The salty breeze carried with it the promise of a good day for fishing, and the fishermen stirred in the quiet village, their day beginning long before most had even stirred in their beds. José Salvador Alvarenga stood by the dock, his hands calloused and steady as they worked the lines on his small fiberglass skiff. The boat was nothing fancy, just a bare-bones vessel painted white, its sides scuffed from years of use. It had carried him through countless journeys, and he trusted it. On this morning, as always, he prepared it with quiet efficiency, checking the engine, inspecting the nets, and stocking the provisions. He had chosen the life of a fisherman not out of necessity, but out of love for the sea. The ocean had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. Growing up in the coastal village of Garita Palmera in El Salvador, the waves were his first playground, the fish his first source of income. He learned early on that the sea was a giver but also a taker. It provided food and livelihood but demanded respect and patience in return. Moving to Mexico a few years earlier had been a natural extension of his life's path. The fishing village of Costa Azul, tucked along the southern coast, welcomed him. The language of the sea was universal, and among the fishermen he found camaraderie and purpose. This day, November 17, 2012, began like any other. José had taken a contract to fish for shark and sailfish, a profitable catch for his employer. He loaded the boat with just enough supplies for a 30-hour trip, a cooler packed with ice to store the fish, a couple of gallons of water, and a few small bags of tortillas and beans. He traveled light, knowing the boat's space was better used for the haul. José's companion for the journey was Ezequiel Córdoba, a young man with limited fishing experience. Alvarenga had initially planned to prepare the boat with his usual mate and trusted companion. However, at the last moment, Perez was unable to join him. Determined to head out to sea, Alvarenga quickly arranged to go with Ezequiel Córdoba instead, a 22-year-old nicknamed Piñata, known around as a standout defender on the village soccer team. Alvarenga and Córdoba had never exchanged a word before, let alone worked together. The boy's inexperience didn't worry him. José had enough knowledge for them both. The two men pushed off from the shore as the villagers watched. Some waved, and a few shouted words of encouragement. The morning air was cool, and the sea lay still, a mirror reflecting the sky. It was the kind of calm that fishermen cherished, an omen of a fruitful day. The boat's small motor purred as they headed into deeper waters. Ezequiel sat quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. José glanced at him, reading the apprehension in his posture, reassuring him there was nothing to fear but to respect the sea. Ezequiel nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. José didn't push. He knew the sea would teach its lessons in its own time. By mid-morning they reached their fishing grounds, a spot José had visited many times. He cut the engine and the boat bobbed gently on the waves. The two men set to work, casting lines and baiting hooks. The rhythm of fishing was as natural to José as breathing, but for Ezequiel, each movement was deliberate, uncertain. The first catch came quickly, a flash of silver beneath the water, the line taut and thrumming. José pulled the fish into the boat and then handed the line to Ezequiel for the next cast, guiding his hands. Slowly he began to find his rhythm. The boat filled with their catch, the cooler growing heavy with the promise of a good haul. As the day wore on, the horizon blurred, the sky and sea melding into an endless expanse. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the water. José checked the time and calculated their position. They had ventured farther than usual, driven by the lure of abundant fish. He decided they would fish a bit longer before heading back. The ocean remained calm, its surface like glass. But José, a man attuned to the sea's moods, felt a strange unease. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that pressed down on them. He scanned the horizon but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Let's call it for the day," he said finally. Ezekiel began reeling in the lines without argument. The younger man seemed relieved to turn back. As the engine roared to life and the boat began its journey home, José cast one last look at the horizon. Something lingered there, a tension he couldn't name. He shook his head and dismissed the thought. The sea was vast, and it often played tricks on the mind. The wind began to pick up as they motored toward shore, and José adjusted his grip on the tiller. Ezekiel leaned back, exhaustion written on his face. José didn't say it, but he felt proud of the boy. He had done well. The waves began to swell gently, their crests catching the fading light. The shore was still a distant line on the horizon, and José focused on the journey ahead. The sea, which had been so giving, now seemed to whisper a different tune, one that spoke of challenges yet to come. But for now, José kept his thoughts to himself. The sea was his friend, and it would guide him home. Or so he believed. The first gust of wind came softly, like a whisper. Alvarenga felt it on his face, a fleeting caress that set his instincts on edge. He glanced at the horizon. The clouds were low and gray, spreading their shadows across the sea. He had known storms before. This wasn't yet a storm, but the sea rarely announced its intentions. It acted without mercy, without warning. "The weather's changing," José said. He didn't explain further. The boat rocked gently as the waves began to swell. José checked the small engine, running his hands over the controls, feeling for any signs of trouble. It wasn't a powerful motor, just enough to push the fiberglass skiff against the current. It had served him well before, but today, it needed to be flawless. The first drops of rain spattered the deck. José looked up again. The clouds had thickened. The rain began as the steady rhythm that soaked their clothes and blurred their vision. The sea, once calm, now churned with restless energy. The waves slapped against the hull. Ezekiel sat huddled in the bow, his arms wrapped around his knees. José didn't blame him. Fear was a natural response. But fear had no place here. The sea did not care for fear or courage, it only demanded respect. The storm arrived suddenly, as storms at sea often do. The wind howled, driving the rain sideways, sharp as needles against their skin. The waves rose higher. Alvarenga gripped the tiller with hands made steady by years at sea, his eyes fixed on the waves ahead. Each swell rose like a wall before the tiny craft, and he maneuvered through them as a surfer might, leaning into their power, slicing where he could. The coast was out there somewhere, though the storm worked to erase all memory of it. The horizon disappeared, swallowed by the chaos. Around 9 a.m., Alvarenga saw it, a mountain rising on the horizon, its dark outline a promise. His heart leaped. They were close. 2 hours, maybe less. The weather, however, had other plans. The motor, beaten by salt and strain, coughed and sputtered, then fell silent. Alvarenga grabbed the radio, shouting into it, contacting a man back on the docks. "Willie! Willie! Willie! The motor is ruined!" Willie's voice crackled back, calm but distant. "Calm down, man. Give me your coordinates." "We don't have GPS. It's dead. Lay an anchor," Willie ordered. "There's no anchor," Alvarenga shouted, his frustration mounting. He'd noticed it missing before they'd set out, but it hadn't seemed necessary on a deep-sea mission. "Hold tight. We're coming for you," Willie assured him. "Come now," Alvarenga yelled. "I'm getting screwed out here." Those were the last words he would ever speak to the shore. The engine sputtered, choking on salt spray. José's hands moved quickly, his fingers working the controls, coaxing life back into the machine. But the storm had other plans. A massive wave crashed over the bow, drenching them both. The engine let out a final desperate wheeze before falling silent. The silence was deafening. José stared at the motor, willing it to restart, but the storm's fury was absolute. They were adrift now, a tiny vessel in a vast and merciless ocean. Ezekiel's voice broke through the roar of the wind. "What do we do?" he shouted, his eyes wide with terror. "We bail," José replied, tossing a bucket toward him. "Keep the water out of the boat, don't stop." But Córdoba was unraveling. His strong body, made for soccer and hard labor, was no match for the relentless spray and the boat's violent lurches. He clung to the rail, his knuckles white, his stomach heaving into the sea. He had signed on for $50 and the promise of a short trip, but now his cries mixed with the roar of the wind. I can't do this," he screamed, tears streaking his salt-covered face. "Bail, damn it," Alvarenga barked as he started to bail water himself. The boy tried, but terror and exhaustion overtook him. He had strength but no reserve for this. The crashing, the soaking, the fear that their tiny boat would shatter, spilling them into the water for the sharks to take. The storm raged on, unrelenting. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The rain pounded them, the wind screamed in their ears, and the waves seemed determined to swallow them whole. José's muscles burned, his hands raw from the constant bailing. But he did not stop. Stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant death. At some point, the storm began to wane, its anger spent. The wind softened, the rain lightened, and the waves lost their teeth. But the damage was done. The storm had stripped them of everything: the cooler of fish, their meager supplies, and their sense of direction. José stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was no sign of land, no indication of where they were. The vast, endless sea stretched in every direction, mocking him with its emptiness. Ezekiel slumped against the side of the boat, his face pale and his body trembling. As night fell, the two men huddled together, their boat a fragile speck in an infinite ocean. Above them, the stars emerged, indifferent witnesses to their struggle. The storm was over, but the true ordeal had only just begun. The sun rose on the endless horizon, casting its light across the open ocean, illuminating nothing but water. It had been days. How many? José Salvador Alvarenga couldn't say, since the storm had thrust them into the vast, uncaring blue. The little fiberglass boat bobbed gently now, its movements a stark contrast to the fury of the storm that had stripped them of their engine, their supplies, and their sense of direction. The vastness of the ocean was suffocating. By day, the relentless glare of the sun turned the sea into a shimmering, blinding desert. By night, the darkness was so complete it felt like they were drifting through space. José sat at the stern, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of land or rescue. None came. The horizon remained a mocking, endless line, always distant, always unreachable. Ezequiel Córdoba lay in the bow, his face pale and his eyes sunken. The young man had spoken little since the storm. The hunger had already begun to gnaw at their bellies, a dull, insistent ache that refused to be ignored. Knowing they had to eat, José reached over the side of the boat, looking to catch fish with his bare hands. His hands moved with practiced ease, feeling for movement beneath the surface. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, his fingers closed around something slick and wriggling. He pulled it from the water, a small fish, its silver body flashing in the sunlight. Ezekiel scoffed at the thought of having to eat raw fish. "It's all we have. Eat or you won't have the strength to survive," José demanded. Ezekiel hesitated, but hunger eventually overcame him. He tore into the fish with shaking hands, his face contorting as he chewed the raw flesh. José watched him for a moment, then turned back to the water. They would need more. The first days were the hardest. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, an invisible predator stalking their every moment. They learned to eat whatever the sea provided: small fish, jellyfish, and the occasional turtle that wandered too close to the boat. José showed Ezekiel how to crack open the turtle's shell, how to drink its blood for hydration, and how to chew its meat without thinking of the taste. Rainwater became their most precious resource. When the skies opened, they held out their hands, mouths, and makeshift containers to catch every drop. On days without rain, they were forced to drink their own urine, a grim necessity José didn't bother to justify. Survival left no room for pride. The sun became their enemy, beating down on them with merciless intensity. José's skin, already weathered from years at sea, turned dark and cracked, blistering under the relentless heat. Ezequiel, younger and less hardened, suffered more. His face and arms were raw, his lips split and bleeding. At night, the cold was just as brutal, seeping into their bones and leaving them shivering. Time became meaningless. The days blended into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. José kept his focus on survival, his mind occupied with the next meal, the next drop of water. He refused to think beyond the present. To dwell on the enormity of their predicament was to invite despair. Ezequiel was less resilient. The boy grew quieter, his spirit dimming with each passing day. He stared out at the horizon for hours, his expression vacant. When he spoke, his words were tinged with hopelessness. One day José caught a bird, a small sea-bound creature that had strayed too close. He wrung its neck quickly and efficiently, then plucked its feathers. The meat was tough and stringy, but it was sustenance. Ezequiel refused to eat it first, his face twisted in disgust. "Eat, you need your strength," José insisted. "I can't do this anymore." Ezequiel repulsed. José grabbed him by the shoulders, his grip firm, and insisted he eat. Ezequiel stared at him, tears streaming down his face. Slowly, he nodded. He took a bite of the bird, his hands trembling. José sat back, exhaustion washing over him. He didn't know how long they could keep this up, but he knew one thing. As long as they were alive, there was hope. And hope was enough, for now. The hunger became a constant companion, an ache that never fully left. It was a battle they fought every day with no end in sight. But José held on, driven by a single unshakable belief that somewhere beyond the horizon there was land, and he would find it. After weeks adrift, Alvarenga and Córdoba became scavengers of the sea, adept at spotting the stray treasures the ocean surrendered. They learned the types of plastic that floated past, with each piece a possible lifeline. They plucked empty water bottles from the waves, storing them with care. One day, a green trash bag floated within reach. They snared it, hauled it aboard, and tore it open. Inside, a lump of chewed gum. They divided it, savoring the almond-sized morsel as though it were a feast, its fleeting flavor a cruel reminder of forgotten pleasures. Beneath layers of oily refuse, they struck gold. A half head of cabbage, a few limp carrots, and a quart of milk. The milk had soured, but they drank it, letting the thick, curdled liquid slide down their throats. It was the first fresh food they'd seen in weeks. For a brief time, with backup food stored and a turtle's meat in their bellies, the men found respite. They talked as the sea stretched endlessly around them. They spoke of their mothers, and for God to forgive them for being bad sons, with promises of working harder when they returned. But the promises rang hollow, born of guilt and longing. They both knew it was too late. 2 months passed, and Alvarenga adapted to the cruel rhythms of survival. He caught birds, wringing their necks with practiced hands, and pried meat from the tough shells of sea turtles. But Córdoba was fading. The young man had grown weaker since eating raw seabirds, and the sickness never left him. He made a choice Alvarenga couldn't understand. He stopped eating. At first, Alvarenga coaxed him, offering slivers of bird meat or a bite of turtle. Córdoba clenched his lips shut, refusing. He gripped a water bottle but had neither the energy nor the will to lift it to his mouth. Depression gripped him like a tide, pulling him under, and no words from Alvarenga could bring him back. One day, they made a pact. If Córdoba survived, he promised to visit Alvarenga's parents in El Salvador. And if Alvarenga lived, he swore to find Córdoba's mother in Mexico. "Tell her I am sorry I couldn't say goodbye," Córdoba said. "Tell her not to make tamales for me anymore. Let her know I've gone with God." "I will tell her," Alvarenga replied. He meant it. By the time Córdoba's strength had gone, he could barely speak. "I am dying," he whispered one morning. His voice was dry, brittle, like a leaf crumbling in the hand. Alvarenga brought a water bottle to his lips, tilting it gently. But Córdoba did not swallow. Instead, his body tensed, small convulsions rippling through him. Alvarenga's heart raced. "Don't leave me, fight for life. What am I supposed to do here alone?" he agonized. Córdoba's face was pale, his eyes open but empty. His last breath rattled out, and he was gone. Alvarenga froze, his mind unable to accept it. He propped Córdoba's body in the bow of the boat, fearing a wave might wash it overboard. He sat with the corpse for hours, weeping openly, his sobs swallowed by the vast ocean. The next morning, Alvarenga stared at the lifeless form of his companion. He spoke aloud, asking the same questions they used to share. "How was your sleep?" he asked. Then, in a hollow imitation of Córdoba's voice, he answered, "I slept well. And you? Have you had breakfast?" The easiest way to face the solitude was to pretend Córdoba hadn't died. Day after day, Alvarenga kept up the charade. He spoke with the corpse as if the young man were still alive, his voice steady, his mind slipping further from reality. 6 days passed this way. One moonless night, as Alvarenga sat in the dark, deep in conversation with his dead companion, he suddenly snapped to clarity. He was talking to a corpse. Resolute now, Alvarenga moved to the body. He washed Córdoba's feet, an act of reverence. The young man's clothes were still useful, so Alvarenga stripped the sweatshirt and shorts from his stiffening frame. He pulled on the red sweatshirt, its pattern of skull and crossbones oddly cheerful, and finally prepared to say goodbye. Sliding Córdoba's body over the edge, Alvarenga hesitated. He spoke one last time to the friend he'd lost. Then he let go. The body slipped into the water, disappearing beneath the waves. As it vanished, the weight of it all overwhelmed him. Alvarenga fainted, collapsing into the tiny boat, alone with the sea and his grief. When Alvarenga awoke, fear gripped him. The weight of Córdoba's death pressed on him, but his will to live, and his mother's words that suicide would bar him from heaven, kept him scanning the horizon. Sunrise and sunset were his best chances. The light sharpened shapes, turning smudges into silhouettes. He could spot a ship as a speck on the horizon, identify its type, a container vessel or a tanker, and then wave and shout until his voice gave out. They passed, cold and indifferent. Some 20 ships crossed his path, and though they offered no rescue, each sighting renewed his desperate hope. As weeks turned into months, the solitude was unbearable. So Alvarenga turned to imagination. He tasted the finest meals, felt the deepest love, and walked the world, all within the confines of his tiny boat. "I paced back and forth, pretending I was exploring new lands," he said. It kept him alive, a defense against despair. He marked the time by the moon's cycles, counting 15 full ones since he had first drifted. He often thought heaven was his next stop. Then the birds came. They filled the sky, wheeling and crying, their presence a promise. Alvarenga followed their path and saw it. A green island rising from the mist, surrounded by turquoise waters. He froze, afraid it was another hallucination. But the land stayed vivid and real. He watched it for hours, calculating his chance of reaching it. It was small, wild, no bigger than a football field. The sight did not fill him with joy, not immediately. Joy required energy, and he had none left. His body was a shell, barely more than bone and sun-scorched skin. His thoughts were slow, but somewhere deep inside a spark flickered. The ordeal might end after all. With his knife, he severed the line of buoys that had steadied him for months. Without them, the boat would be vulnerable to storms, but he needed speed, not safety. The gamble paid off. The waves pushed his small boat toward the jagged reef of the island. The atoll rose like a fortress encircled by coral that seemed determined to keep him at bay. The boat scraped against the reef, grinding to a halt. José struggled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The motion was foreign after so many days of sitting and lying in the boat. He stumbled, nearly falling before stepping into the shallow water. The sensation of sand beneath his feet was overwhelming. He had been drifting for so long, the ocean his only companion. To feel solid ground was almost painful, the earth unfamiliar and strange. The sun bore down as he staggered onto the beach, his limbs heavy, his vision blurred. He collapsed into the sand, gasping for breath. Face down in the sand, he clawed at it, grabbing a handful. "I held it like a treasure," he said later. Finally, after more than a year, 438 days to be precise, he was on solid ground. Although he didn't know it, Alvarenga had washed ashore on Tile Islet, a small island in the Ebon Atoll, on the southern tip of the 1,156 islands that make up the Republic of the Marshall Islands, one of the most remote spots on Earth. José Salvador Alvarenga crawled naked through the jungle, his knees and hands scraping against sharp coconut shells and damp palm fronds. He was too weak to walk more than a few steps before collapsing. The scent of salt and rotting vegetation filled his nostrils as he stumbled forward. Finally, he stood at the edge of a narrow canal, staring across at a small beach house. A man and a woman appeared, their faces a mix of curiosity and alarm. "I saw this white man yelling. He looked weak, starving. I thought he must have fallen off a ship," Emi Libokmeto said. Tentatively, they approached him. Alvarenga tried to explain being adrift for more than a year at sea. He drew stick figures: a man, a boat, and the endless ocean. But the shapes felt hollow. Frustrated, he asked for medicine, for a doctor. The couple smiled kindly, their words unintelligible to him due to the language barrier. When they began to laugh, Alvarenga laughed too. He didn't know why, only that the sound felt good. "I was laughing because I was saved," he said later. An island inhabitant sailed to Ebon's main town to fetch help. By afternoon, a nurse and police officers arrived to take Alvarenga back. He hesitated initially, unsure of leaving the shore he had long dreamed of. But they coaxed him aboard, and he finally relented. Word of Alvarenga's arrival spread quickly. Soon he was taken by boat to Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands, where he was placed in the care of doctors and local officials. The journey was short compared to the 438 days he had spent at sea, but it felt monumental. As the boat cut through the water, Alvarenga's mind remained fixed on the events that had brought him here. He thought of Córdoba, the young man whose life had slipped away in the middle of the ocean. He thought of the sharks, the turtles, the storms that had threatened to end him. He thought of the nights spent staring at the stars, talking to a corpse, praying for rescue. And now, here he was, alive. Doctors at the hospital in the Marshall Islands treated Alvarenga for severe malnutrition and swelling in his legs. They noted scars and tissue damage from prolonged exposure. Alvarenga answered their questions as best he could, his voice hoarse from disuse. A wild-looking man washing ashore on a remote Pacific atoll spread worldwide. The lone phone line in Ebon became a lifeline for newsrooms around the world, wondering if this was true or a hoax. The evidence supported his tale. His boat's registration matched records from when he'd set sail on November 17, 2012. Jaime Marroquin, a Mexican search and rescue official, confirmed a desperate search had been launched for Alvarenga and Córdoba when they disappeared. The length of his voyage was calculated as 5,500 to 6,700 miles, or 8,900 to 10,800 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean. After 11 days, Alvarenga's health stabilized enough for travel. Diagnosed with anemia and suspected liver parasites from eating raw meat, he was sent home to El Salvador to reunite with his family. In El Salvador, the celebration of survival was muted by memories of Córdoba. Alvarenga traveled to Mexico to meet Córdoba's mother, Ana Rosa. Sitting with her for hours, he answered her questions, sharing every detail of her son's last days. It wasn't the same to survive without him, Alvarenga admitted. But life on land was far from simple. He feared the sight of water and couldn't sleep in darkness. The press overwhelmed him, and he appointed a lawyer to handle the onslaught of requests. Later, a dispute over representation led to lawsuits, adding stress to a man already grappling with his trauma. It took a year before Alvarenga could comprehend the enormity of his ordeal. Studying maps of his drift across the Pacific, he pieced together his journey. For 438 days, he had fought hunger, thirst, storms, and madness. He had survived the death of his only companion and endured loneliness that clawed at his sanity. "I suffered greatly, but I didn't take my life. You only get one chance to live. Appreciate it, Alvarenga said. Alvarenga's story remains one of the most extraordinary tales of survival. He had faced the ocean's full fury, surviving on wit, grit, and an unshakable will to live. Though he would never return to the sea, Alvarenga carried its lessons with him. He knew its beauty and its cruelty, its power to give and to take. And in its vastness, he had found himself broken, battered, but alive. It doesn't matter how skilled or prepared you think you've been. The storm doesn't care. The wind tears at you, screaming louder than your thoughts. The waves slam into you with the force of a battering ram, each one threatening to capsize your vessel. Rain lashes down like 1,000 needles, blinding you, drenching everything, and the cold burrows into your bones. The boat lurches and groans, and every sound feels like a death knell. In that moment, survival isn't about control. It's about holding on and hoping the sea will tire of toying with you. Preparation and quick action are critical. Secure yourself, stow loose gear, and ensure everyone wears a life jacket. Point the bow into the waves to minimize capsizing risks, reduce speed, and stabilize with a sea anchor if possible. Stay calm and methodical. If the storm becomes unmanageable, retreat to the most secure part of the vessel and wait it out. If thrown overboard, conserve energy, stay afloat, and hold on to any floating object. Avoid swallowing seawater and keep your head above water. Once the storm passes, focus on collecting water, signaling for rescue, and conserving resources. Rainwater is precious. Capture it with anything available, but never drink seawater. Improvise fishing tools for food, but prioritize hydration. Protect yourself from sun exposure by day, and conserve body heat at night. Mental resilience is key. Establish routines, stay alert, and avoid despair. Signal for rescue with reflective objects, flares, or a radio if available. Survival demands patience, creativity, and a steady mind. The ocean is vast, but persistence and a steady mind can keep you alive long enough to overcome an outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.